So we've talked about unit testing. I'm going to briefly talk about the other two kinds of testing, and then we're going to see how to do it. The other kind of testing is called functional or end-to-end testing. And to kind of go back to the example of Nordstrom's, and let's wait for their page to load. Someone should improve their page load time. But to circle back to this feature that we were talking about at the beginning, we've built this new feature that shows the original price with the strike through when something's on sale. And we've written unit tests for our logic that grabs the data from the database to get the old price and the new price information and calculate 40% off. And we've written a unit test to make sure that it calculates 40% off correctly, that it calculates 38.90 correctly. And we've learned how we can write a function to mock that database call to get that information so that I can run my tests locally on my machine as I develop. And then these unit tests can be great for continuous integration. And now our product manager is like, awesome, but I really want to make sure that this is always showing up on the actual website. Is there any way that we can do that? And that's where functional or end-to-end testing comes in. And this is when you test an entire feature from the client to the server and back. And that's why it's called end-to-end. I usually hear end-to-end testing as the term, but functional testing as well, as in like testing an entire function. Testing that something is functioning. That is a bit confusing because we're not actually testing an individual function. I normally hear the term end-to-end testing. These tests are the slowest kind of tests that you can write, but they also give you the strongest degree of reliability that your program, the whole program, is behaving correctly. Because again, we're going to see how we can spin up a browser, run our program in it, and like check to see that this div is here. So it's the slowest kind of testing, but also gives you the strongest guarantees. Often you will have to automate a web browser to do end-to-end tests for web apps. We're testing our app from the user's perspective. And we can drive the browser, click on links, check that divs with a certain class or ID exist and have a specific value, etc. Just as a kind of aside, there is another kind of testing called snapshot testing. And this is where the front end runs in the browser and a screenshot is taken. This screenshot is compared with a saved good screenshot from a previous test run. And snapshot testing is used to confirm that a web page or web app UI looks exactly like it should. and it's good for catching regressions in CSS. This is not as common, but it can be very powerful. Because again, if we're Nordstroms, we probably also want to make sure that this looks right. And maybe this is a legacy code base and the CSS is a mess, which is something I have encountered. So maybe there are reasons why we particularly need to make sure that this stuff looks right, and that can be trickier than it appears. But often with end-to-end testing, we're really testing behavior and we're driving the browser. And end-to-end testing involves testing all parts of our application.
What exactly do you mean by automate a browser?
Yeah, that's what we're going to see next. There's a couple technologies to do this. This tool Selenium is sort of like the classic tool. Like you can even use this if you have to do tons of manual stuff in forms. Like in the browser, we've seen, you know, I can do window location, href, and I can navigate somewhere, right? I can also, I have to Google this, but dom get element by ID, document get element by ID. Like, let's see, get element by, let's find something to get. Here we go, a footer, perfect. Well, I'm not going to try and write code off the cuff, but let's see here. Document, of course. Document get elements by tag name. Footer, does that work? Yep. So we have things that we can write in JavaScript code to interact with the browser. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but the same way we can write this line of code to grab the footer, we could write it to like get the inner HTML, for example, or we could print it to a string. That's not such a great example here, but if we had like one specific div, maybe we can print it to a string. Like just the same way we wrote an assertion before, if we have code that can interact with the browser, we could assert that the footer exists. We could assert information about the class on the footer. We can even, again, I don't remember this command off the top of my head, but click on a link. I think, I'm not sure if it's the click command, but so with JavaScript and these DOM methods, we could write a program to navigate around the browser and do stuff. Does that make sense, Alicia?
Yeah, to an extent.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot clearer once we write some code to do it, which is exactly what we're going to do. So just to talk a little bit about the history of this, there's three things we need to know. The first is something called Chromium, which is an open source version of the Chrome browser. The next thing we need to know, and let's talk about web app end-to-end testing. Automates a browser, usually uses Chromium, can run, and we're interested in Chromium because Chromium specifically we can run in headless mode. Running the browser code without the actual window or GUI. And so this means I can like run an actual browser from the command line and write JavaScript to interact with it and click on pages and do all sorts of stuff but we're not actually going to ever see the browser window. It's the browser program running, but we don't actually see the window. And that's kind of like the magic of this stuff.
So is that connected to the database or you feed it fake information?
That's a great question. So the cool thing is when we're doing this, we would load up our web app and we probably would have that app connected to our database. We can use browser automation to go to actual websites as well. I think what I want to do is just start writing some code, both in the interest of time and also because I think once you folks start seeing this, it will be a lot easier to talk about and ask questions about. So I'm just going to make a note. About which tool to use in our notes, and then I'm going to kind of get the ball rolling. There is a little setup that I did offline that I have documented that I'll talk us through. But the main thing is I want to install this program called Puppeteer, which is what we're going to use to automate interacting with the browser, and thus the name Puppeteer. And that's going to be a dev dependency. It's an NPM package. Puppeteer is supposed to install this open source version of Chromium. On my Mac, it did not. It may be because it was an M1 Mac. I'm not sure. I'm not going to go through this right now because it takes a bit of time, but I do have this documented in the notes I'm going to post. I installed Chromium with Homebrew for Mac. So not everyone may have to do that. I'm going to create a new test file. I'm just going to call it example Puppeteer test. And it's just going to be an example Puppeteer test. And just like we have, we're still going to be using VI test. We're going to be writing describe blocks and it blocks and things like that. We're also going to need to use the Puppeteer NPM module, which we have to sort of import the old school way. It's not an, I believe it's called an ES module. So we have to use this require operation. And I'm just going to build out a little bit of example code so we can see what's going on. And I hope this is going to be really cool. So Puppeteer is going to let us start up a browser. It's going to let us navigate to a browser page. We're going to use this behavior that we haven't seen yet called before all, which is part of VI test. And you often might use this when writing unit tests too. What it does is whatever we put in the function here is going to run before every single test, before every it block. And specific to Puppeteer, because we're going to be having Puppeteer do things like open an actual browser, which we're going to see in a minute. It's going to be an asynchronous operation. So we're actually going to use an async function. And this is why writing end-to-end tests for web apps that use like React or our single page app can start to get tricky. You can do this with normal web pages too, because really anything that shows up in a browser, we can write an end-to-end test like this for. And so I'm just adding a console log to track stuff, I am going to so this is also where stuff can get tricky because the configuration for this can get a little tricky. I have this much more documented in my notes that I will add to here. I have like 20 lines of comments that I added around each of these config items. But essentially, we're going to tell Puppeteer to actually open a browser window so we can see it, which is great to do when we're writing these kinds of tests for the first time so we can see how things work. And sometimes you might want to watch stuff happen. We're going to tell it to run in slow mode, slow-mo, and slow everything down by 100 milliseconds. Otherwise, we would be clicking on like links and doing stuff in the browser super, super fast. And then again, I have more notes on this, but I had to tell the Puppeteer program we are using where to find Chromium. Because Chromium, it's an actual browser. Here, I'll drag it over here so we can see it. And it looks exactly like Chrome because it basically is Chrome. Google adds a bit of proprietary stuff around Chromium. It's actually probably a bit more, but Chromium is essentially like the heart of Chrome open sourced. So I did have to tell the Puppeteer library we're using where to find Chromium in my operating system on my computer, and it's where Homebrew installed it. So you may or may not need to do this. Start out by not doing this, and then if you need to, you can do it. And this is also why this is not a good code along demo. The last thing we can do is we can even have the browser open with DevTools open. And it looks like that needs to be a comma. So there's a bunch of setup that needs to happen here. And let me code up what this before all is going to do for us. Puppeteer is actually going to launch a browser. It's going to open up Chromium. And we're using, I think you folks have started to see this pattern more and more in JavaScript, where there's a JavaScript object and each property is sort of a config setting. And we're passing that into Puppeteer. And these console logs I added just as I was doing my debugging yesterday. And you'll note that we're using await for all of these because Puppeteer is using promises with async and await because these are asynchronous operations since we actually have to wait for a browser to open or to do something with the browser before our JavaScript program continues executing. Just like we have a before all, we have an after all. And I know I've been covering a lot of ground here. I think we should have about a good 10 minutes for questions. I just want to make sure to get this working, the whole feature working, because I think it will make it a lot more fun and easier to talk about it. So as your tests get more complex, especially with end-to-end tests, you may need to do some cleanup to make sure that every time you run a test, everything is in the exact same condition. So we want to close our browser between each test run so that each individual it block is starting with a fresh browser so that there's no behavior from one test that messes stuff up for another. And give me a moment and I am going to actually just slack myself a bit of code. because it is a bit of, there's a couple of pieces here, and it'll just, this bit is better just to slack and paste, and I can then walk through it. So thank you for bearing with me as I do this. So we've got our describe block here. And it looks like I may have missed something. So before I paste anything, I'm going to double check that all my parentheses and curly brackets are where I expect them to be. I'm using a Vim keyboard shortcut to do that, but VS Code also, if you kind of hover over here, will have little arrows for curly brackets that you can use to check stuff. And I will do this all the time to make sure that stuff is looking right. And it looks like I just need to close that one here. And now this is the closing one for the main describe block for the whole file. And this is extra. I am 100% certain there is a VS Code keyboard shortcut to open and close these two. Because I use the Vim mode, I'm not sure what that is off the top of my head. If anyone wants to throw that in the chat, that would be awesome though. And here's our actual test. So there's a lot of pieces that happen here along the way. And it just looks like I have to clean up a couple things from slacking. So I just have to, for some reason, backticks got in here. So I'm just going to replace that with single quotes. And we should be good to go. Let me very quickly walk through what this is supposed to do. And then we're going to talk about it. Or rather, then we're going to run it. So there's going to be 2 steps here with end-to-end testing. And I have some notes that I'll flesh this out for the other installed steps and everything that we've been discussing. You want to start your actual app. You want to make sure your test code is using the right host name and port for your actual app. Run the, and then we run the Puppeteer end-to-end test. And that's what we're going to do right now. So way back at the beginning of the lesson, we created a default Vite project, which gives us that dev command to start up like the hello world of React applications. And it tells me right here, the host name is localhost because it's running on my computer, and the port is 5174. And that's important, and we're going to want to put that in our test code. And there are ways to automate that, again, probably using environment variables. But just to kind of get things started for today, that's not so critical. So, and I want to do one thing to my code here. I'm going to go to the app.jsx. I'm going to add right under Vite and React, a paragraph. The ID is going to be welcome. And the message is going to be welcome. And actually, let's just make this an H1 so it's really easy to see. Now, if I go back to my app, it loads. And what our test is going to do is we're going to use Puppeteer to drive the browser to open Chromium, to open it to this URL, to use a DOM selector function, DOM get element by ID, to grab the DOM node, which is this H1 tag, the that has the ID welcome. And we're going to look at the text and say, hey, does it say welcome? And if so, that's our assertion. The test returns true. Let's take a look at what that looks like. And it's actually not too bad. And again, we're using async await and this page command that, to recap, we set up over here using Puppeteer that gives us this sort of interface to interact with the browser page. So we're telling the browser, go to this URL where I have my app already running. If I didn't have it running, we would just see an error, and we can look at what that is. We need to tell the page to wait until it loads. Puppeteer gives us a convenience method to wait until this specific selector loads. This should really say selector loaded. We then want to grab that particular DOM element by ID. This $ notation is an older notation that comes from jQuery, which was like the Batman's utility belt of JavaScript for before React existed, that everyone was using in their JS web applications. So I don't want to go into it too much, but essentially this is actually a shorthand just for a function to grab a DOM element by this ID for welcome. We use this evaluate command to get the inner text, which should be the welcome text. I'm console logging it here. I did this as debugging. And then after all this work, we can do an assertion to see, does the text include the word welcome? And we're expecting that to be true. And it looks like I might need a closing parentheses. No, oh, that's a backtick, which it took me a minute, but VS Code has this sort of, it's doing a very subtle highlighting there, and that's how I noticed that. So that, I know that was a lot of stuff, and fingers crossed, right? This is the moment of truth. Let's see, why do I have two? That's the local host. What do I have running here? Let me make sure my app is still running. Nope, it's not. Wow, how did we get from that was working just from, oh, okay. That must be from a different directory and some other stuff I was doing. Phew. Reload. Okay, so this is
a different port.
Yeah, thank you. So now that's working. Just so there's no confusion, let me close all this out. I'm going to create a new terminal. It should open it right where I want it to be, but I always check. Fingers crossed. Oh, let's go into the test app. So when I run this test file, it's going to run both of our tests. We'll run these random tests, and then it'll run the Puppeteer tests. And there's a way to tell your test runner to just run a specific file, but I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. So that's the magic right there. I'm going to do it again because I know there was quite a buildup. I'm going to go to this config setting for slow-mo, and I'm going to make it 500. So let's just make it 1000. So everything will be slowed down by 1000 milliseconds. So just to reiterate, we're going to run this Puppeteer test program. It's going to open up a browser with this Chromium, basically a version of Chrome. And it's then going to use a bunch of DOM selector methods to like look at our app, grab data, and then we can run this assertion on the data. I'm really excited. I hope you folks are excited. So we have this tab. Chrome is being controlled by automated software. It's going really slow because I added the 1,000 millisecond delay on every step. And in fact, that is too slow and the test timed out. And this just illustrates the challenge of end-to-end testing with tools like Puppeteer and Selenium, is that there's all these finicky things that start to happen. So let's try a 500 millisecond delay. And the test passed. So let me show, let me pause and check in. I'm really excited. I'm curious what people think. I want to show two kind of cool things with this, and then it's a day. But yeah, what are people's thoughts, questions? Does this kind of make sense? Is this like, okay, I'm going to have to watch this again at some point? What's on people's minds? Or lunch. If lunch is on your mind, I totally understand. That's totally legit as well.
It's cool, but I definitely will have to watch it again.
Yeah, exactly. And again, the goal of today is not to like go off and do this. As like unit tests, everyone can get rolling on. The end-to-end testing, there is a lot of moving parts. That's also why, in terms of, you know, getting out there and applying to junior developer roles, when you have the time to dig into this more, like if you write end-to-end tests with Puppeteer and have that on your GitHub and can talk about that, that's huge. You know what I mean? If like once you're in the door, you're able to talk about that in the interview process, that's huge, because this is not a trivial task by any means. Yeah, I'll run it again in a moment. I see a couple questions. Alicia.
So would this really be used to check like every single element on the page is saying exactly what we expect it to say, or are you checking key highlights that had variables that had to calculate things, or does it all just depend, or what?
That is a great question. And the short answer is key highlights. This kind of testing is too slow and takes time to check everything. The caveat to that might be, again, to go back to the Nordstrom's example, if I'm a company where my web app site is making a lot of money and I might also have a lot of money, then I might add end-to-end testing for more places. But there are whole companies that provide end-to-end testing as a service.
Okay. And then my second question was, without us having actually done this ourselves, or really truly knowing how to set it all up ourselves rather than copying and pasting to make sure that a DOM element equals what you put in there, right? We haven't gone over really anything else other than that example, which is not me complaining about the lecture, obviously.
No worries at all.
Constraints. I'm just saying, with us only having this tiny little view into what's possible, let's assume we haven't yet had time to dig more into the end-to-end testing. What would be kind of like a good answer for if an interviewer were to say something along the lines of, do you have experience with unit testing or end-to-end testing or what have you? Or
yeah, that's a great question. I think there's two parts to that answer. If it's like, I have an interview and I haven't had a chance yet to really write some unit tests or end-to-end tests, and the interviewer asks, have you had experience writing tests for unit tests or end-to-end tests? You would say, basically, you want to turn the negative into the positive. The negative is, hey, I haven't done this yet. The positive is, I know about this. And honestly, for a junior role, that is a big thing. And also that you know how important it is. So I would say something like, yeah, that is a great question. You know, that is something I really want to do. We did talk a lot about testing and how important unit tests are and end-to-end tests are. And I've written, you know, a hello world unit test for my portfolio project, but I really want to flesh it out. and I'm really excited to try and use Puppeteer to write some end-to-end tests. So basically use that question to demonstrate that you know about these things and kind of name drop Puppeteer essentially to show that you're familiar. And you could even say, yeah, you know, we're using VI tests. So that's kind of how I would handle that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good question. The other answer to that is unit testing is dramatically easier than end-to-end testing. So I would say at the end of the course, because I know we have a lot going on with the personal projects and probably the group projects, when there is time, you definitely want to pick something that's going to be your portfolio project for interviews that you know inside and out and that you can talk about this way. And I would just pick one project, whether it's a new one you do after the class is over, or a personal project, or a group project that you work on, or whatever. But I would say that once class is over, taking some time to write some unit tests for a portfolio project is one of the best investments of time that you can do. And just to reiterate, unit testing is way easier. This is really all we need with unit testing. We install VI tests, we import these, and then we just import functions. It's probably going to be functions with JavaScript from our code. And so start there. And then that way, when the interviewer asks about it, you can talk a bit about unit testing and then be like, yeah, I'm really stoked to learn about using Puppeteer for end-to-end tests. Oh, and when they ask that, you should definitely ask them, how do you guys test? What's your testing strategy? How do you can be like, yeah, I've heard end-to-end tests are great, but they take a lot of time and energy. How do you guys do that? Because what you're doing there is you're showing an understanding of like those professional tasks of being a software engineer, of writing tests and what's involved with that. And that's a huge positive. And then it gives them a chance to talk about their tech architecture, and then you can kind of transition that question into a bit of a technical conversation. And that's really what this lecture today is for. It's not about being an expert in testing or even being able to implement it. It's about being able to like be in the room when there's a conversation about testing. Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, Alicia. And Dalton, I know you had a question.
I was actually just going to ask you to run it again.
Yeah, totally. Let's do it. Let me kind of clear the stage. So let me quickly highlight the key parts here. We have a command here that uses Puppeteer to open the Chromium browser. We run it before every test. We tell our browser to open a blank page, probably like a new tab. Then in our specific test, we're then using Puppeteer to tell Chromium to go here, which is, again, to reiterate, what I also have running is my web app, right? And in fact, if I kill this and I run this test, we are going to get an error. It opens the browser. We have to wait a minute. We saw that sort of error message, and we see this big old error connection refused. And the reason we're getting this is because we're telling the browser, go to localhost 5173, but I don't have my dev server for my React app running. There is no web server handling requests on localhost port 5173. Does that bit right there make sense to folks? This is actually a really good thing to dig in and ask questions about. And after this, we'll probably call it a day. And let me go ahead and start that hello world app again, just that dev command that starts the dev server. So that's already up and running. And now when I run this test command, Puppeteer opens Chromium, waits for the page to open, navigates to that URL where I have my app running. And we can't see the bit here, but let me go ahead and change this and then we can see what happens. Because what it's doing is, well, I'll talk it through as it happens again. And let me see if I can slow it down a bit more without it timing out. Let's try 700 milliseconds. Puppeteer opens Chromium. It goes to the URL in the port where we've got that app running. It's grabbing this welcome HTML attribute using like a get DOM element by ID method. And then it's looking at the inner HTML value of that, the actual text. I apologize. The timeout, I think we're struggling there. So I'll run this one last time. This one is going to fail because I've added all these exclamation points which aren't in the text there. So we can see that failure. And then I'll run it one more time as a success. So it's grabbing that welcome. It's comparing. And now we get this failure where it's saying this bit of text that we extracted from that DOM element, I expected it to include this substring welcome with all these exclamation points. The syntax here is a little bit different. This includes function returns a Boolean. So we're saying, hey, we expect this to be truthy. We could have done it. Yeah, that's probably the better way to do it. If we wanted to be exact, we could have done it a little different. And just to change it back, and actually I'll write it the way we saw, welcome text to be welcome. Another way of doing the above. And I'll comment that out. And it looks like there is, oh, I forgot. There we go. And so what we're saying here is it looks at this text. It's expecting this string to include welcome in it. And I'll run it one more time. And like, I think what would help to maybe to illustrate it is if it was a test that was maybe clicking on links, but that's a bit much to set up. I think the last thing I want to quickly show is if we set this headless value to true, it's going to do the same thing, but we're never going to see Chromium pop up. And this is how you would run this test on like a test server in the cloud, because like a server in the cloud isn't going to have a monitor for a browser window to pop up on. And like if I go to app.jsx where it says welcome, and I change this to hello, I can run that test again, and now it's going to fail. And it's slow because it's actually opening a browser. And if it helps folks, I can run that with the browser again. But this might be a good time to check in, see what people are thinking, see what questions people have, and break for lunch. So yeah, what questions do people have? What is on your mind? waiting for selector and getting the element. Okay, Logan, so that's a good question. What is the difference between waiting for the selector, which we do here, and getting the element? And Alicia, you're correct. Like, we need some way to tell this code right here to wait until that page on the browser has fully rendered. There are several ways to do that. This specific method says, hey, wait until you can find this element on the page. I suppose there might be a way to actually grab it, but it can be useful to separate that into steps because we might have to do more work with it or something like that. Yeah, great question. And Alicia, thank you for responding in the chat. I think I'll run it one more time just for fun. And if anyone has any questions, and then we can wrap it up. I really appreciate people kind of digging in for this lecture. Oh, I wanted to run it in headless false. I know that this was a bit of a digression, especially with the personal projects. Again, our hope is that this sets you up to have good technical conversations as you interview, and also just show again part of like the landscape of kind of what being a developer is all about. So yeah, unless there's anything on anyone's mind, let's break for lunch. And then the afternoon is for working on personal projects, and we can do stand down at 4.